Hello, and welcome to Trundlebed Tales. Now, a couple weeks back, I read a chapter of Rilla of Ingleside, and it was for a read-along group on Facebook, and there's still time for you to go back and watch that one, either just my chapter or the entire book, because part of the read-along is that they had members of the group read a chapter each. And today I'm going to be doing the same thing for their next book, which is Jane of Lantern Hill. And before I get going on that, I want to make sure that you see my t-shirt. Now, I wore this last time too, and I love this shirt. I got it on my high school graduation trip to Prince Edward Island, and I got this at the Anne of Green Gables gift shop. And I very seldom wear it because I love it to death, and I'm so afraid it's going to get destroyed. And so, because I'll never be able to find another one. So, I thought today it would be worth wearing. And with that, Jane of Lantern Hill is a little different than the other Montgomery books. For one thing, it's set later. It's set in the 1930s, as you can probably see from the little girl on the front. And it is also not part of a series. So Jane sort of stands alone on her own in here. Now this book, I told you last time for Rilla that I had 2 copies of it, and I just have 1 copy of Jane of Lantern Hill. When I was a kid, every time we used to go to the mall, I'd go to B. Dalton Booksellers and get another Montgomery book because they were all out. And this was one that is actually, they're the Bantam series. And Jane actually, there is a chapter, fairly early chapter that's split differently in between editions, but for the most part all the words are here. So I don't have to be careful to reach out of a certain edition, they're all the same. And I was trying to think, if you haven't read Jane, what could I compare it to make you get the feeling of it? And I would say that it is a lot like the Parent Trap movie, which is one of my very favorite movies, starring Hayley Mills, not the remake. And in it, it doesn't have all of the elements of the Parent Trap, but it does have a girl who did not know anything about her other parent, had only lived with one of them, and the mother, and had a grandmother who was even more dictatorial than the grandmother in the Parent Trap, and then discovers she has a father who has this much more open and free and supportive and country life, and she has to split some time going back and forth. Now there's only one girl here, but her name is Victoria Jane, and when she's living with her grandmother, she's Miss Victoria, and when she's with her father, she's just Jane. So there's almost 2 girls there. And I think if you really liked The Parent Trap, you will enjoy this book. Now, after I read it through the first time, I decided that I needed to explain a couple things. Since this is just a chapter out of the middle, I'm going to be reading chapter 27. First off, there are really strange names in this book, and that happens a lot in rural areas, that people will, in true rural areas, not suburbs or housing developments, there are kind of odd nicknames people have. So there's a couple names in here which will seem very odd to you, but they're just people's names, so go with it. She mentions cleaning the moon, and before she discovered her father wasn't dead, she had this game, because she really wasn't allowed to play with anybody she liked, and so she had this game where she'd look out her window at the moon and imagine cleaning the moon and building up a beautiful house there and a beautiful garden, and she mentions that, so that's what she's talking about. She also mentions that Aunt Em, and she almost repeated what Aunt Em had reputedly did, which was being blown across the harbor, because she's walking in a strong wind, and Aunt Em was a little tiny little thing, and they had said she'd been blown across the harbor one day, which was of course a joke, but that's what they're referring to. They mention Dad's Old Contemptible, which is his pipe and is kind of a play on what people used to call pipes. There are 2 cats in the household, First Peter and Second Peter, because she got a cat and named it Peter, and then somebody else gifted her a cat and its name was also Peter. So she's got First Peter and Second Peter. And they also have a dog named Happy. And her mom's name is Robin, and Robin had left the dad. She had gone for a trip to visit her mom and never came back. And I think she really wanted him to come after her, and when he didn't, she took it as a sign that he really didn't want her after all. There's more to it than that. But when they talk about her leaving, he always assumed she left thinking she'd never come back, which really wasn't the case. And I think that's all you need to know to enjoy Chapter 27 of Jane of Lantern Hill. August slipped into September. Jimmy John began to summer fallow the big pasture field below the pond. Jane liked the look of the fresh red furrows, and she liked Mrs. Jimmy John's flock of white geese swimming around the pond. There had been a time when Jane had kept a flock of white swans on a purple lake in the moon, but now she preferred the geese. Day by day, the wheat and oat fields became more golden. Then Steppyard mowed the Jimmy John wheat. The Peters grew so fat catching evicted field mice that Dad told Jane she would really have to put them on a slimming diet. Summer was ended. A big storm marked the ending, preceded by a week of curiously still weather. Steppyard shook his head and didn't like it. Something uncommon was brewing, he said. The weather all summer had behaved itself well. Days of sun and days of friendly rain. Jane had heard of North Shore storms and wanted to see one. She got her wish with a vengeance. One day, the Gulf changed sulkily from blue to gray. The hills were clear and sharp, foretelling rain. The sky to the northeast was black. The clouds were dark, with bitter wind. Lots of interesting rain coming. Don't hold me responsible for it, warned Steppyard when Jane started home from the Jimmy Johns. She literally blew along the path and felt that if Lantern Hill hadn't stood in the way, she might have emulated little Aunt Em's reputed exploit of blowing over the harbor. There was a wild, strange, hostile look all over the world. The very trees seemed strangers in the oncoming storm. "Shut the doors and windows tight, Jane," said Dad. "Our house will just laugh at the east wind." The storm broke suddenly and lasted for 2 days. The wind that night didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like the roar of a wild beast. For 2 days you could see nothing but a swirl of gray rain over a grayer sea. Hear nothing but the tremendous music of huge breakers booming against the stubborn rocks of Lower Queen Shore. Jane liked it after she got used to it. Something in her thrilled to it. And they were very cozy, sitting before their fire of white birch wood with those wild nights, while the rain poured against the window, and the wind roared and the Gulf thundered. "This is something like, Jane," said Dad, puffing on Old Contemptible with a Peter on either shoulder. "Mankind must have a hearth fire after all. It's cold life warming yourself before other people's fires." And then he told Jane that he had decided to keep on living at Lantern Hill. Jane gave a gasp of joy and relief. At first it had been vaguely understood that when Jane went, Dad would shut up Lantern Hill and go to town for the winter, and Jane had consequently been cumbered with certain worries. What would become of her windmill full of geraniums? The Jimmy Johns had enough of their own to look after. Dad would take Happy with him, but what about the Peters? And the house itself? The thought of its unlighted windows was unbearable. It would be so lonely, so deserted. Oh, Dad, I'm so glad. I couldn't bear to think of it missing us, but won't you? How about your meals? Oh, I can get up a bite for myself, I dare say. I'm going to teach you how to fry a steak and boil potatoes before I go, said Jane resolutely. You can't starve then. Jane, you'll beat your husband. I know you will. It's no use trying to teach me to cook. Remember our first porridge? I dare say the Jimmy Johns won't see me starve. I'll arrange for one good meal there a day. Yes, I'm staying on here, Jane. I'll keep the heart of Lantern Hill beating for you. I'll water the geraniums and see that the Peters don't get rheumatism in their legs. But I can't imagine what the place will be like without you. Oh, you will miss me a little, won't you, Dad? A little. My Jane is trying to be humorous. But my one consolation is that I'll likely get a little real work done here on my Methuselah epic. I won't have so many interruptions, and I'll be able to growl without getting dirty looks. You may have just one growl a day, grinned Jane. Oh, I'm so glad I made lots of jam. The pantry's full of it. It was the next night that Dad showed her the letters. He was at his desk with Second Peter snoozing at his feet when Jane went in after washing the supper dishes. He was leaning his head on his hand, and Jane thought with a sudden pang that he looked old and tired. The cat with the green spots and the diamond eyes was winking at him. Where did you get that cat, Dad? Your mother gave him to me for a joke before we were married. We saw it in a shop window and were taken by the weirdness of it. And here are some letters I wrote her, Jane. One week she and her mother went over to Halifax. I found them tonight when I was cleaning out her drawer. I've been laughing at myself. The bitterest kind of laugh in the world. You'll laugh too, Jane. Listen. Today I tried to write a poem to you, Robin, but it is not finished because I could not find words fine enough, as a lover could not find raiment dainty enough for his bride. The old words that other men have used in singing their loves seem too worn and common for you. I wanted new words, crystal clear or colored only by the iris of light. Not words that had been stamped and stained with all the hues of other men's thoughts. Wasn't I a sentimental fool, Jane? I watched the new moon tonight. Robin, you told me you always watched the new moon set. It has been a bond between us ever since. Oh, dear, oh, how dear and human and girlish and queenly you are, half saint and half woman, and half very womanly woman. It is so sweet to do something for someone we love, even if it's only opening a door for her to pass through or handing her a book. You are like a rose, my Robin, like a white tea rose by moonlight. I wonder if anyone will ever compare me to a rose, thought Jane. It didn't seem likely. She couldn't think of any flower she resembled. She didn't care enough about those letters to take them with her, Jane. After she went away, I found them in the drawer of the little desk I'd given her. But she didn't know she wasn't coming back then, Dad. Second Peter snarled as if he'd been pushed away by a foot. Didn't she? I think she did. I'm sure she didn't. Jane was sure, though she couldn't have given any reason for her sureness. Let me take them back to her. No! Dad brought down his hands so heavily on his desk that he hurt himself and winced. I'm going to burn them. Oh, no. No! Somehow Jane couldn't bear to think of those letters being burned. "Give them to me, Dad. I won't take them to Toronto. I'll leave them in my table drawer. But please, don't burn them." "Well," Dad pushed the letters over to her and picked up a pen, as if dismissing the subject of the letters and her at the same time. Jane went out slowly, looking back at him. How she loved him! She loved even his shadow on the wall, his lovely clear-cut shadow. How could Mother have ever left him? The storm spent itself that night with a wild red sunset and a still wilder northwest wind, the wind of a fine weather. The beach was still a maelstrom of foam the next day, and the shadows, the wild black clouds, kept tearing over the sands. But the rain had ceased, and the sun shone between the clouds. The harvest fields were drenched and tangled. The ground in the Jimmy John orchard was covered with apples. And summer was ended. There was an indefinable change over everything. That meant autumn. And that is chapter 27 of Jane of Lantern Hill. Don't you like it so much? Don't you want to wait and read the rest of it? So you'll find Jane of Lantern Hill by Ella Montgomery, and find the group on Facebook for the Rilla of Ingleside read-along. And if you can't find it, message me and I'll send you a link. Thanks for joining us today on Trundlebed Tales, and remember to brighten the corner where you are.